it isn't just disappointing. This entire thing is disgraceful. This isn't just a harmless preference. It's grown into systemic bias. Most of the Muslim are subjected outright to exploitation, trafficking, and abuse. It's systemic anti-blackness, and this short, fragile life is what we choose to waste on arrogance and racism. Honestly, come on, you guys. What happened to your intellect? Hey guys, so this isn't typically what I would be hoping to talk about, but I definitely think that there's this huge gap between what we're taught Islam represents and what we do as Muslim people in our communities. When we talk about racism in Muslim communities, I think it's very important to start with this gap between Islam as a religion and Muslims as people. Because on paper, if you go to the Quran and Prophet Muhammad's life, if you study his life, Islam couldn't be clearer. We're told over and over again that there's no superiority of an Arab over a non-Arab, or a white over a black person, or a black person over a white person, except through piety and good deeds. And the Quran and Islam as a concept reminds us that humanity was created in nations and tribes so that we could get to know each other, and not so that we could exclude one another or rank ourselves over each other. But in reality, I think we all know that that's not the case, and that's not how it's actually played out. That's not the reality in Muslim spaces, and that there's this gap between the ideals and lived experiences. For a lot of people, this gap isn't just disappointing, it's disillusioning. And when you grow up believing that your community is built on justice, equality, and fairness, and then when you experience discrimination in your mosques, in marriage conversations, and in how people assume that your level of deen is tied to your ethnicity, it's so disheartening, and it hurts. It makes you feel like, what happened to all that talk? We were talking about how Islam is so perfect, and how we have the perfect book, but then it doesn't translate to reality and what's actually happening on the ground for many people. And I think that's where the conversation begins. And it's not by questioning Islam itself, it's by asking how Muslims in practice built hierarchies that Islam was made or was supposed to dismantle. And we have to be real in this, in that in Muslim communities, whether people want to admit it or not, there is a racial hierarchy, and it's really bad. It runs on skin tone, it runs on ethnicity and unspoken stereotypes that determine who gets respect and who doesn't. The lighter and more Arab you are, the higher up on the ladder you are. The darker you are, especially if you're black, the further down you fall. And it shows up everywhere when we talk about marriage, when there's family gossip, which obviously is not right, and proposals where being fair or lighter skinned is listed kind of above religious quality. And this isn't just a harmless preference. It's grown into systemic bias, in the sense of light skin is coded as more beautiful, more refined, more marriageable, more religious sometimes. And researchers call this dissonance symbolic capital, in that it's a currency that gives you access to things that others are denied. And when it comes to Arabs, this is where the problem deepens. Being Arab doesn't just mean having the lighter skin, it means carrying the weight of the Arabic language and being tied to Prophet's lineage. And because you're tied to the Prophet's lineage, you're seen as more authentically Muslim. And many Muslims, even non-Arabs, constantly buy into this idea that Arabs are much more religious and more spiritually trustworthy. And Arabs themselves often believe this too, and it shows up in attitudes more than words. You see it when Arabs dominate mosque leadership, when non-Arabs automatically defer to them, in the sense of that they're seen as more religious in debates or in discussions, or when Arabs are treated as the default Muslim in any media. And yet, this isn't an abstract idea. It has real-world consequences. East and West African domestic workers in the Gulf, many of them Muslim women, are regularly abused because of their race. Sudanese, Somali, and South Asian migrants face structural exploitation under Arab employers. And while the world rallies behind Syria or Palestine, as it should, don't get me wrong, where is the same sympathy when Yemen is starving, when Sudanese people are being slaughtered, when Congolese Muslims are being exploited for resources? And most of the time, often, it's done by our Arab brothers and sisters, it's honestly disgusting. And we pick and choose which lives are worth our tears, and more often than not, the darker the skin, the less sympathy we give collectively. And when we look at South Asian Muslims, they do hold power in some contexts. For example, in Britain, they dominate mosque boards and Islamic organizations. And even there, even in those places where they dominate the scene, Arabs are placed above them in the sense that they inherit and reinforce anti-black biases and are still excluded from Arab majority spaces where they're seen as less authentic. It's a hypocrisy within a hypocrisy. And when we look at mixed or biracial Muslims, they're often stuck in the middle and pushed to the side, being seen as too dark for some, not Arab enough for others. Rarely are they treated with dignity from both communities. And then there's black Muslims, where there's this immense anti-blackness rhetoric that is undeniable at this point, where black Muslims are constantly treated as less Muslim, less religious, less trustworthy, less desirable for marriage or any other socially constructed system. In British mosques dominated by South Asian people, black Muslim women reported being sidelined, silenced, and even feeling inferior to their other Muslim counterparts. In the Gulf, black migrant workers, most of them Muslim, are subjected outright to exploitation, trafficking, and abuse. It's systemic anti-blackness, and pretending it doesn't exist only deepens the issue. And at the very bottom of the ladder are dark-skinned black Muslims. If light skin is considered symbolic capital, then dark skin is, I guess, by default, symbolic debt. The darker you are, the harsher the treatment, rejection in marriage proposals, invisibility in the mosque leadership, assumptions that you're less intelligent, less pious, less refined. A West African woman once described how she felt and how she kept getting turned down for marriage, not because of her faith or her character, but simply because of her skin tone and features. Imagine the humiliation to be told you're not good enough for a brother in Islam when the only thing they can point out is the melanin that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put in your skin. Let's deep dive into Arab superiority because there's a lot to talk about here. There's this unspoken belief in the Muslim world that Arabs are somehow the real Muslims in the sense that they're more authentic, more knowledgeable, and more connected to God. It's subtle, but it's everywhere, especially when people give more religious credibility to a random Arab speaker over a learned non-Arab scholar. And these are the micro moments, these microaggressions that build culture. And the dangerous part about the superiority complex is that it's not new. It has historical roots in that after the Prophet Muhammad's death, ﷺ, Arab dominance was baked into early Islamic empires, politically, socially, linguistically. Non-Arab Muslims like Persians or Africans often had to fight to be treated as equals. There was even a whole movement about it in the 8th and 9th centuries called the Shu'ubiyya, where non-Arabs rebelled against the idea that Arabs are inherently better. So this issue isn't modern, it's ancient. It's just repackaged through colonialism, nationalism, and the global obsession with whiteness. And let's be clear, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ never taught Arab superiority. In fact, he condemned it directly. Imagine doing something that the Prophet Muhammad and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala condemned. Imagine doing it with chest, come on. Like you're doing it with your whole heart and you're acting like this is the right way to act and to treat people. That's embarrassing. Honestly, I don't know what else to say. And the fact that he condemned it directly, this isn't Islam. It's Arab cultural nationalism disguised as religion. It's the elevation of being Arab as an identity over being Muslim as a believer. And this plays out in so many ways. In Muslim majority countries across the Middle East, Arabs often occupy positions of higher power politically, economically, socially. And non-Arabs, especially African and South Asian migrants, are relegated to lower wage exploitative labor. You have entire populations of East African workers in the Gulf trafficked, beaten, and underpaid, while many of their employers call themselves good Muslims. This is cognitive dissonance at its peak because you pray 5 times a day, but you treat another Muslim like a disposable object because of their skin color or accent. How audacious. But even in global Muslim discourse, Arab suffering is often prioritized over anyone else. When we talk about Palestine, since Palestine has been under constant attack, which it has been for quite some time now, the world rallies together, especially in the past 2 years. As it should, it deserves that solidarity. But where is the same outrage for Sudan, Yemen, Somalia, the Congo? The empathy gets weaker the darker your skin is, the poorer the nation, the less Arab the face. And it's not compassion, it's not care, this is selective humanity. And we even see meet in spiritual spaces, if an Arab gives a lecture, people listen differently. They assume depth, they assume correctness. But if a black Muslim speaks, the reaction is much quieter, as if their words carry less authority. Even the aesthetic of religiosity has been Arabized. From the way people dress to the way they speak Arabic to the nose accent or beard that looks more Islamic. It's wild because even the image of what a good Muslim is supposed to look like is colonized. And it's not just Arabs perpetuating it. It's non-Arabs, without realizing, are reinforcing it, because people from South Asia and Africa have internalized the same hierarchy. They treat Arabs as spiritually superior, even if those Arabs look down on them. It's internalized racism, an inferiority complex that runs really deep. And let's be real, it isn't just disappointing. This entire thing is disgraceful, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala literally says, we've created you into nations and tribes so that you could get to know one another, not so that you could turn around and despise one another. Yet Muslims have turned it into, we've created you into nations and tribes so that you can rank over one another and be better than one another. Not based on anything like taqwa or any kind of religious standing or character standing. It's based on how you look. How did we go from revelation and the beauty of revelation to arrogance so quickly? How did we take faith and tear it down to tribal pride? When we had examples like Bilal radiallahu anhu, a formerly enslaved black man, be chosen to call the adhan. How did we go from that to building these racial hierarchies centuries later? We love to point fingers at the West for racism, but we can't even acknowledge the anti-blackness, colorism, and Arab chauvinism that thrive within our own ummah, within our own communities. We quote Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's words about equality, but ignore them when it comes time to marry off our children, when it comes time to hire someone who's darker, when it comes time to grieve lives that aren't Arab or light-skinned. We have to face the truth. Arab superiority has become the most damaging social disease in the Muslim world, and it divides an ummah that's supposed to be united. It contradicts the core beliefs of Islam, and it makes us look like we've learned nothing from the message that we claim to follow. You know, it's honestly very disappointing because we've been given everything. We've been given the perfect book, the Quran, and we've been given the perfect example through the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And we were told very explicitly that no Arab is better than a non-Arab, and no white person is better than a black person. No tribe is superior over another, except through taqwa, righteousness, and God consciousness. Yet somehow we've thrown that all out the window for the sake of ego, status, and temporary validation. This life, this short, fragile life, is what we choose to waste on arrogance and racism. Honestly, come on you guys. What happened to your intellect that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us to use critically? The mind that was meant to distinguish right from wrong, justice from oppression. Frankly, it shows the lack of maturity, lack of education, and it's not just formal education, but spiritual education. It doesn't take a degree to recognize hypocrisy. It doesn't take a PhD to know that mocking or devaluing someone's worth because of their race contradicts the entire foundation of Islam. Actually, it's shocking. It's actually quite shocking how we as Muslims can read the same Quran that tells us that the most honored among us is the most righteous, yet we still, even through reading that, build our own communities based on color and ethnicity. We repeat phrases like Islam is perfect, but Muslims aren't, as if that in itself excuses our behavior. When does accountability start? Because saying Muslims aren't perfect doesn't justify staying ignorant or arrogant. We're not supposed to settle for imperfection. We're supposed to strive for ihsan, excellence in character and in worship. At some point, we have to stop pretending that we don't see it. The Arab superiority complex, the subtle colorism in marriage conversations, the quiet and casual dismissal of black Muslims in leadership, scholarship, and even spirituality. This isn't Islam. It's a matter of ego and pride disguised as piety. It's killing the unity we're supposed to be known for. The humanitarian catastrophe in Sudan and places like Eastern Congo or in other parts of East Africa receive far less global attention and outrage than other conflicts. The disparities in coverage are striking. It's selective visibility, and you might think, oh well, it's just a small gap in attention, it's harmless. No, it's not harmless, because that attention means funding, it means rescue corridors, it means diplomatic pressure. Millions starve and die in silence, and inside Muslim communities it gets worse and worse. We amplify some tragedies into moral movements and reduce others into occasional mentions. The Gulf's labor and sponsorship systems have trapped hundreds of thousands thousands of migrant workers, many of them Muslim, in conditions that amount to forced labor, passport confiscation, withheld wages, restricted movement, violence, and debt bonds. Migrant workers from East Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia are disproportionately affected. International bodies and investigative outlets have repeatedly documented how legal frameworks and sponsorship systems make exploitation routine. When the same countries post pious statements about Islam and human dignity, yet maintain systems that dehumanize mostly darker people, it exposes the brutal hypocrisy within these nations. And we also have the horror of human trafficking, modern-day slave markets, and racialized violence that overwhelmingly affect Black migrants over any other racial group. In Libya, investigations and reporting show that African migrants fleeing poverty were held in appalling conditions, sold and abused by traffickers and militias. And isn't it enough? Isn't it enough that Black Muslims are already being mistreated by people in the West? Isn't it enough that we have to face racism and systemic oppression in other parts of the world already, and yet we still do not find solace within our Muslim brothers and sisters communities? How is that okay? Like, how do you desensitize yourself so much that you don't care? What happened to the rahmah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said to cherish? What happened to that empathy? Where is that mercy? You expect it, but you don't give it back. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put that as a standard. African American Muslims also often report being sidelined in mosque leadership, ignored in community organizing, and treated as less religious, less authoritative than their light-skinned counterparts. And it's really strange because the ethnographic and sociological scholarship on Muslim communities in the US and the UK show how Black Muslim religious styles and leadership are marginalized while they have been central in many Muslim social justice movements. And let me just put it more simply. African American and Black Muslims typically are the first to stand up and protest for something that is unjust. Are they ever called to be given the credit they deserve for standing up and fighting? They're always at the forefront of the fights because they know what it feels like to be disillusioned. But never are they accredited, and their voices are never amplified. In fact, they're minimized, and yet somehow we still respond with, we care, but logistics, geopolitics, or media ecosystems determine coverage. Fine, but that explanation can only go so far. The voices that major organizations and broadcasters and advocacy networks make, to whom they amplify, to which photos they circulate, to where they direct funds, are human choices shaped by biases, assumptions, and about whose lives are more relatable or newsworthy. When those choices continuously undercut Black Muslims' lives, silence becomes a form of structural violence, and we need to call that out honestly. And finally, to understanding this moral consequence, selective empathy erodes the idea that the Ummah is a single body. The Prophet Muhammad taught the believers that we are like one body, that if one part of our body hurts, the whole will react. Selective empathy turns that teaching into virtue signaling. It lets us feel righteous for showing solidarity for some time while permitting our inaction elsewhere. If our compassion is conditional, calibrated on skin tone or geopolitics, then we have already betrayed the unity we claim to defend. And this is simply a call to broaden our circle of care beyond optics and tribal affiliation, to demand consistent outrage and resources and solidarity for all of the oppressed peoples. And yes, in Palestine, but also in Sudan, in Congo, in Eritrea, in Ethiopia, the Caribbean, the Americas, and everywhere where darker-skinned people, darker-skinned Muslims are ignored. And our Ummah's moral credibility depends on it. At some point, we have to look in the mirror as individuals, as communities, as an Ummah altogether, and ask ourselves, what are we even building? What are we leaving behind? Because what's the point of calling ourselves an Ummah of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ if we're going to betray his teachings at every single turn? What's the point of memorizing the Quran, of performing salah, of wearing hijab, growing your beards, if the inside, the heart, still sways to tribal hierarchies, color, and ego instead of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And we've turned Islam into an identity badge more than a moral compass. We love the feeling of being Muslim, the pride, the belonging, but not the responsibility that comes with it. We quote verses verses about unity, but our mosques, our marriages, our social circles, our sympathy screams segregation. And it's embarrassing because we've been given the perfect book, the perfect example, and yet we throw both aside for temporary ego, petty pride, and for the illusion of superiority. You waste your short time on this earth to act like your skin tone, your ethnicity makes you better, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already told you to use your intellect, to think critically, and to rise above this ignorance. And frankly, I just have to make it clear, it shows a lack of maturity, a lack of education, not academic but spiritual, because racism isn't just bad manners, it's a disease of the heart, and if we're too proud to diagnose it, then it will destroy everything we claim to stand for. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Do not turn your face away from people in arrogance, nor walk in pride upon this earth. Indeed, Allah does not love the arrogant and boastful." But arrogance is exactly what we've normalized. The arrogance of Arab superiority, the arrogance of color hierarchies, the arrogance of thinking that wealth or lineage somehow brings you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is what we've normalized. We've confused religiosity with race, we've mistaken privilege for piety, and worst of all, we've used Islam, the faith that abolished tribalism, to quietly reinforce it. And that's not misguidance, that's hypocrisy. Because how can you say you follow Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, a man who stood shoulder to shoulder with Bilal radiallahu anhu, a black man who was once enslaved, and declared that no Arab is superior to a non-Arab, no white person is superior to a black person except in taqwa, yet you still look down on your brother or your sister because of their skin color? How can you beg Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for mercy while withholding it from others? We can't keep calling this a cultural issue. It's not culture, it's moral, it's spiritual, it's a failure of the heart. If the heart is corrupted, the whole body is corrupted. And maybe that's what hurts the most, that we, the Ummah, given divine guidance, still choose ignorance, that we've been handed the cure, but we'd rather stay sick. You waste this short life chasing superiority, feeding your ego, and guarding your tribe, but in the grave, none of that will matter. On the day of judgment, the one that you will stand before does not care about what country you're from, the shade of your skin. He cares about what the state of your heart is. Maybe it's time to stop using Islam is perfect but Muslims aren't as an excuse to stay flawed. Maybe it's time to bridge that painful gap between Islam as an ideal and Muslims in practice. Because the real tragedy isn't that racism exists in this world. The real tragedy is that it is in the Ummah that was meant to end it.